The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.
Mr. Keatinge, thank you so much for being with us and taking our questions. Let's start with what are some of the reasons that might be the basis of the decision to sanction countries and individuals.
I think historically, before the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, most countries used sanctions for delivering a foreign policy message. We do not approve of what you're doing, part of their diplomatic toolbox. Of course, at the international level, the United Nations used sanctions in security situations, for example, against North Korea for its nuclear program, against terrorist organizations. But of course, the UN is broken. The ability of the UN to agree on anything these days is very limited. And so I don't think we'll see sanctions coming from the UN Security Council again anytime soon. So we come back to what do individual countries do? And historically, that's been about messaging. Now, of course, in the case of Russia, for Europe, for the US, for the UK, and other countries around the world, it's not just about messaging. It's about trying to disrupt the resourcing and the funding of the Russian military and its war in Ukraine.
What are some of the differences of sanctioning individuals and sanctioning the countries? And also, what is the perspective of the EU on this and the US on this?
So to your second point, I think the EU has learned a lot of lessons in the last 2.5 years. Historically, the EU was quite light on sanctions. It used sanctions for diplomatic messaging. The High Representative, the EAS, the European External Action Service, was the body that would be sending a political message, a foreign policy message, to a country that it did not approve of its human rights activity or of its the way in which it was messing up with international security. The EU's come a long way, as I say, and so now, of course, it is buying into the use of sanctions in a more robust way, a more muscular way. You might say a more American way. The joke that I often make is that, the Americans have for a long time been asking the EU to be tougher on sanctions. Now the EU is starting to be tougher on sanctions. When it comes to the difference between people, countries, and indeed entities, companies, the main focus is that the sanctions regimes on people and on entities freeze their assets, ask banks or require banks to freeze assets so that those assets cannot be used by the person or the company in question. They also impose travel bans, something we should talk about more as well. On countries, it's much rarer nowadays to see sanctions on full countries. The concept of smart sanctions, of sanctioning individuals and companies, is much more popular. And so it's very rare to see full embargoes on countries. That takes us back to the times before 1991, the times of the Soviet Union and the Cold War.
Is it a smart way to sanction not only the individuals who are responsible for doing something very wrongly, but also like imposing a broader sanctions on their family members, those businesses that are associated with them? Why is that? And do you think sanctions are, in principle, the effective way to change the motivations of these individuals and change their behavior in the end?
You raise an important point, which of course is if someone is sanctioned, they know they have been sanctioned and they will take action in order to try and avoid those sanctions. So family members are an important part of an avoidance network, friends from maybe high school, business associates. And so when a name is sanctioned, it's certainly the case. And again, we've seen this development over the last 2.5 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that sanctions don't just target the person in question, the boss of the company or the oligarch, but they also target the children or the wife or the husband or maybe people who are known associates. So the point is that if sanctions are going to be effective, they need to target the right individuals. You've seen examples where people suspecting that they might be sanctioned in the future. We saw this in the early part of Russia's war in Ukraine. Oligarchs moved the ownership of their assets to family members because they were pretty sure they would be sanctioned, and they wanted to future-proof themselves. So we have seen the US and the EU take measures against wives and daughters and sons as well.
You mentioned travel bans, and somehow it is perceived that travel bans are not as a big deal as, for example, financial sanctions. What are the specific aims or specific goals of these sanctions?
Well, I think you raise a fair question. So if assets are frozen, if sanctions require assets to be frozen, then banks around the world, whether they are in the US, the EU, or in Georgia, will consider that requirement and proceed cautiously, and indeed will, in some cases, freeze the assets. Travel bans, of course, only work if people want to travel to the United States or to the EU. If they are happy to stay in Georgia, or to stay in Russia, or to stay in any other country, the travel ban brings no real pressure. But I do think that you see, particularly in situations where the United States, obviously the State Department uses visa bans quite extensively against individuals that it believes are not upholding the international rule of law, are not upholding the kind of US values, then travel bans, I think, are, if you like, a first step, we can say.
Is it comfortable to be on that list? And do individuals that are sanctioned, even though they might be saying that this is not a big deal, try everything not to be on those lists?
Oh, I'm sure they absolutely do, because there is no doubt that their life becomes more restricted. I think an important point to remember is that when somebody's name goes on one of these lists, it is generally public information. And so banks and other organizations see that information, and they then decide how to react. Now, US sanctions do not apply in every country around the world. They don't apply, for example, in Georgia. But organizations in Georgia might say, well, we want to deal with the United States, and so therefore we are going to consider those US sanctions. So it will inevitably bring restrictions on people, regardless of whether the country in question that they come from is applying US or EU sanctions or not.
How does this affect the image of the country when their high officials or individuals or businesses are sanctioned? Is there this direct link with the country and with the country's image?
I come back to an earlier point, which is that first and foremost, sanctions are used by governments as a messaging tool. And so if the United States or the EU sanctions an individual, they are sending a message, which is that this person does not meet our values. This person does not accord with what we believe is the rule of law. And so inevitably it affects the image of that individual or that company, or indeed that country, if that person is in a senior position in that country. So the sanctions, I think, are more than just about the freezing of the assets or the banning of visas. They definitely set a tone of what one government thinks of another country or another government.
You mentioned EU and the more American way of dealing with sanctions. With this current statement of the EU that we all see that they are open for the enlargement and also for deepening, would that also mean that they will be more open to changing this behavior and to sending the signals that it will be more easier to impose now individual sanctions as well?
I think for countries that are on the EU's accession path, as time goes by, there is an expectation from the EU that if that accession is to be successful, then that country needs to adhere to the expectations of the EU, the democratic standards and so forth. And so what this means is that the EU at that point has leverage. If a country wants to join the EU, then the EU has leverage to slow that down or to speed that up, depending on how the country is progressing. Once a country joins the EU, the leverage goes away. And so I think one can expect to see the EU use its leverage around the accession process as a way of trying to encourage countries to adhere to European values.
And also, when we are talking about any country changing its course or changing its aspirations and then dealing with sanctions, is it about the perceptions of those countries or perceptions of those clubs, whether the country is changing a course or not, or are they studying thoroughly, looking at the signals, for example, like those who are within the country protesting against, for example, changing this course? Is it about like pure perceptions of these clubs or of these countries?
I think there are inevitably two tracks to this. The first is political, so if the EU is really encouraging a country to make progress, it will send positive political signals whenever it can. On the other side, there are bureaucrats in Brussels who are looking in detail at laws and at regulations to see the extent to which those are aligning with the EU's own laws and regulations. And so you've got if you like, a two-track process. You've got a political process, which could be encouraging, sending positive messages to try and keep a country on track. And then you've got the technical work being done by the European Commission, looking at the individual laws and regulations. And those two things have to line up. You can't join the EU if there are positive political messages. Yes, we want a country to join the EU, but at the same time, its legislation is not in line with what the EU requires.
Strategic partnerships with other countries, like those countries that might be against what the EU or what the US stands, be it on a competitive level, be it on a political level, economic level, it doesn't matter at this point. Do you think like these types of strategic partnerships would be an alert sign for these clubs where the country wants to position itself in reality? Of course, understanding that this is the sovereign decision of any country, we're not talking about that, but could that be an alert sign also?
I mean, inevitably, you make an important point there, which ultimately a country is free to make its own choices. It's free to make its own choices as to who it has partnerships with and how it operates. But blocs like the EU are also free to make their choices. And if a country wants to align with the EU, then that country is a very welcome member of the European Union. If that country chooses not to align with the EU, then that country it's made its own choice. But you can't expect the EU to continue to welcome that country if it changes its posture. So as I say, it's a combination of politics, diplomacy, but then also technical factors, which will determine whether or not a country can join the European Union.
We have so many sanctions, lists, blacklists of the companies. How do they differ? And because sometimes there are questions whether the company is sanctioned or not, even though there are a lot of its parts that are being on the blacklist or even being sanctioned. How does that work? Is it like a cautious sign to deal with these kinds of companies, or is it safe to deal with them?
So the sanctions landscape has become extremely complex. If you are a bank or a company, particularly if you're in a country like Georgia that is not part of the European Union sanctions regime, it's not part of the US sanctions regime, you have to tread very carefully. So there are certain banks in Georgia that are listed on the London Stock Exchange. Well, what does that mean for them, given that London is putting sanctions on Russia? You've got companies in Georgia that would like to trade with the European Union or with the United States. What do the US and the EU sanctions mean for them? So it's very complicated. And I think for Georgia, Georgia's geography is a good sign of the challenge that it faces on sanctions, because it finds itself bordering Russia, but it finds itself also wanting to have close relationships with the US and the EU. And that means, therefore, it needs to tread very carefully with sanctions regimes. Particularly, you'll notice that the United States, just these last few days, the Deputy Secretary of the US Treasury, Wally Adeyemo, has been making some strong statements about the importance of international partners adhering to Russian sanctions, and therefore, from a US perspective, and therefore, if you're a company in Georgia, you need to think very carefully about where you see your future. Do you see your future with the European Union, in which case it would make sense to align with EU sanctions? If you don't see your future in the European Union, then it's your choice as to how you want to operate.
Thank you so much for that answer. And also let us talk a little bit about sanctions avoidance, be it international sanctions, be it individual sanctions. Is it, first, is it easy to avoid them? And also what could be some of the consequences if you are caught avoiding them?
I mean, trade data suggests that circumventing sanctions for Russia is relatively easy. But there is an important part in all of this, which is that whenever trade happens, there is also a financial flow. Banks are involved. And what we see from statements from the United States, and indeed it looks as though this will come in the EU as well, is that the authorities in the EU and the US are focusing very closely on banks. So if you are a bank in Georgia that is facilitating sanctions circumvention, you could well find yourself added to the US or the EU sanctions list. So rather than trying to focus on the actual trading companies, the manufacturers, there seems to have been a decision in the G7 or amongst Ukraine's allies to focus on the banks that are facilitating this trade. And banks have an unhappy history of being punished for facilitating sanctions evasion. So we might well see more of that happening in the months ahead.
And my last question, are these sanctions working on Russia? And when should there be some kind of like a watershed moment when we can say that, you know, yes, they are effective and they are already changing the big picture? Or
are the sanctions working is the $24 million question. In some ways they are working. We just talked about circumvention. Circumvention would not be happening if sanctions were not working. But at the same time, Russia is still fighting its war in Ukraine. It's still getting the resources it needs to make its drones and its missiles. So from that perspective, sanctions aren't working. The important message, I think, is that sanctions are a long-term game. They're not going to switch off the Russian economy overnight. So closing circumvention loopholes, pressuring banks to make sure they are only processing transactions that are approved and aren't facilitating circumvention, That's really important. And that's why I think in the months ahead, I would expect to see much more pressure coming, particularly from the United States, on any organization, any bank, any person who is facilitating Russia's war in Ukraine.
Making this parallel with individual sanctions and back to changing their behavior and their motivations, would you say that is also a long process there?
It is a long process. There are a few examples from history where American sanctions have caused a change in attitude very quickly, very suddenly, particularly where people want to have access to the United States, perhaps where their children are studying in the United States. Visa bans can actually be very powerful. But in general, we should never expect sanctions to have an immediate impact. They have to be part of a longer-term strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Keatinge, so much for this very interesting conversation. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you again.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.